Continuing education knows that at the end of the day, students want to graduate, and we can help them do that because we really listen to their needs, and we can offer them flexible options both within continuing education and across the campus.
We don't take a cookie cutter approach. We realize each student comes with their own story. So whether it's a part-time student looking to complete a degree program or someone just looking for online courses, we're there to connect them to the resources of the university.
Thank you so much for joining us at the 78th Annual Conference on World Affairs. My name is Jan Burton, and I served on Boulder City Council and have been quite involved with local civic organizations, and I will be serving today as today's moderator. For recording purposes, today's date is Wednesday, April 15th, Tax Day, and this is 2:30 p.m. The panel title is Empowering Citizens, Civic Education, Information, and You. Now, before we get started, I'd like to read the University of Colorado Boulder's land acknowledgement. The University of Colorado Boulder, Colorado's flagship university, honors and recognizes the many contributions of indigenous peoples in our state. CU Boulder acknowledges that it is located on the traditional territories and ancestral homelands of the Cheyenne, Arapaho, and Ute, and many other Native American nations. Their forced removal from these territories has caused devastating and lasting impacts. While the University of Colorado can never undo or rectify the devastation wrought on indigenous peoples, we commit to improving and enhancing engagement with indigenous peoples and issues locally and globally. We will do this by recognizing and amplifying the voices of indigenous CU Boulder students, staff, and faculty and their work, by educating and conducting research, supporting student success, and integrating indigenous knowledge, and by consulting, engaging, and working collaboratively with tribal nations to enhance our ability to provide access and culturally sensitive support, and to recruit, retain, and graduate Native American students in a climate that is inclusive and respectful. Thank you. Once again, welcome to CWA and today's discussion. We ask that all attendees remain respectful throughout the discussion and refrain from interruptions. Signs, banners, and noisemakers and other audible disruptions are not permitted and will result in those responsible being asked to leave the room. And please turn off your phones and your watches so they don't go off in the middle. Time will be allotted for questions after the original conversations that we have with the panelists. And there are a number of producers walking around in the room, and there they are, they're kind of holding up their hands. And they'll have pieces of paper with pencils, and just raise your hand and they'll give you paper, and they'll give me the questions to ask, and I'll be reviewing all those questions. And I hope you will participate. And now, I would like to ask each of our panelists to introduce themselves, and I'll remind our audience that full speaker bios can be found on the CW website, or if you have the app, it's also on the app. I will be the timekeeper, and I saw someone else do this. If I turn up my what are these things called? Name. Yeah, that. If I turn that up, that means you've got 30 seconds left, okay? So I'd like you to each introduce yourself for 2 minutes, and then I'll ask the first question, and we'll proceed with the panel. So thank you so much to each of our panelists for being here.
Yes, sir. Great.
Yeah.
All right, well, it is so good to be back in Boulder. It's my third year at CWA, and I feel like the conversations are always really rich and nuanced. We can actually not just limit ourselves to sound bites, which I really appreciate. My name's Devin Gray. I lead an organization called End Poverty in California. We do policy advocacy on a range of issues from safety net reform, guaranteed income, housing policy, and the like. But we also spend a considerable amount of time thinking about and trying to shift the ways that prevailing narratives about poverty and the people experiencing it lead to policy debates and policy outcomes and the consequences that come from those things. I think this is a really interesting panel on a really interesting topic, and I think what I'm so excited to dive into is the different perspectives with which the five of us here really have approaching how we approach this question. I think we'll spend a lot of time obviously talking about what civic education means in tangible ways. How do we bring people into the fold? How do we reform our institutions, whether it be journalism or actual election law or administration or our general conception of human rights? How do we reform those things to make civic participation less full of friction and more effective at actually having our body politic reflect the popular will? I think that's really important. But one of the things that I sort of want to name before we even dive into the nuts and bolts of what civic education looks like is that I think that the conversation oftentimes omits really important parts around why people and how people engage in civic life. I think that we have sometimes this prevailing belief that civic education is a consequence of lack of information rather than people rationally identifying that a system may not be working for them and being able to conclude that their participation doesn't yield a reflection of their own desires and beliefs in terms of policy outcomes. And I think that if we are able to address that underlying story that says to so many people that they don't matter in the system, it makes it a lot easier to get them into the fold. So I'm excited for the conversation. Thank you.
Thank you, Devin. Jessel.
Hi, everybody. My name is Jessel Noor. I'm really excited to be here. This is like the biggest event I've ever spoken at, and I normally talk to journalists, so this is like a rare chance to talk to a wider audience, and I'm really excited about that because journalism is a bubble, is its own bubble, and I think we do need to engage more with non-journalists. And so that's what most of my work these days revolves around. It's helping journalists through grants and coaching and really helping to amplify positive impacts that newsrooms are doing. So right now we're working with the Gulf States newsroom down in Louisiana and a few other southern states as an NPR affiliate. We were able to grant them some money so they could go to a community that journalists hadn't really spoken to in the shadow of what will be the largest AI center in the country, the size of Manhattan, and it's being built by a large corporation. And thanks to Louisiana's corporate-friendly laws, it's actually illegal for the community to have their own air monitoring. And so the reason I'm saying all this is because I think there can be a vision for journalism that works in community with their audience, right? Like works in partnership with them. So what they did was they went and talked to this community. The people there said the media never came and talked to us. Like, this data center is always in the news. And then they figured out what they could do, right? And so people were complaining about the air quality, but they couldn't prove it. So this newsroom found a way around that law. Because they're journalists, their work is protected. So they bought a bunch of air monitors with the grant we gave them and are now reporting about what the air quality is in that community. So that's just like one example of what journalism can be. And how much time do I have?
You're out.
I'm out? Okay, yeah. So that's perfect.
Thank you, Jessel. And I love that we've got the journalism focus because we can bring that topic into the whole thing about civic education as well. So thank you, Jessel. Ellen.
Thanks. I'm Ellen Weintraub. It's a pleasure to be back in Boulder for my second time at Conference on World Affairs. I love this conference. It's a whole lot of fun. And I meet fascinating people here, like some of my friends on the panel here. I, for many years, was a commissioner and chair of the Federal Election Commission. I had been elected chair for the year 2025 until the president fired me. So that's my one sentence bio. Oh, thank you. It's quite an honor. I am somebody who has spent a lot of time in public service. I believe in the good that government can do, but I think it is a challenge for those of us who do believe that government can be a force for good in people's lives to demonstrate that, to make government work better, because otherwise people either will turn off and be apathetic and say, there's nothing for me to get involved in, or Perhaps worse, they will decide to vote for the biggest disruptive element they can find, somebody who looks like they're just gonna flip the table and throw everything overboard and be a big destructive force. And if we do not demonstrate that government can be good and can be constructive and can do good things and accomplish good things that will improve people's lives, we see what the downside can be. So, stop there.
Hi, my name is Hadar Harris, and I am an international human rights attorney. I've lived and worked in 25 countries around the world, 25-ish countries, not 25 countries-ish. And this is my third time at CWA, and I love this conference. I am so grateful to the organizers, to Yvette who's sitting back there, to Luca who's around here somewhere, to the students, to the community members, to Jan who housed me last year, because I think that what you've created in this conference is something so very, very special. And it is a form of civic engagement in and of itself. My background is that I have worked on a whole variety of different rights-based issues in various organizations that I've either headed or worked in. Most recently, I was the managing director for Washington, D.C. for PEN America, which works on issues of book bans and academic freedom and freedom of expression. Previously, I was the executive director of the Innocence Project in Northern California, working to free wrongfully convicted people and to reform the criminal justice system. I worked with student journalists at the Student Press Law Center, which I headed for 5.5 years, working on press freedom issues. And the next stage is that I will soon be moving to Los Angeles to head the Promise Institute for Human Rights at UCLA Law School. So there's a through line in all of that, and I mention all those different things because there's a through line of rights-based engagement and civic engagement as it changes the world, and different ways in which we use different methods of engagement to do that. So I look forward to this conversation to talk about them further.
When the producers thought about this topic, this panel, they wrote that there is a growing disconnect among Americans between knowledge of how government works and what they can expect of their government. In times of top-down political upheaval, how do we ensure that citizens are adequately educated and engaged in defending their basic rights? And if each of you can just address that and then rip off each other, and then I think the follow-up question would be, well, I'll follow up after you guys have initially answered this question.
Could you repeat that? I'm sorry.
Sorry?
Could you repeat that?
Yeah, I'll repeat it. There's kind of a growing disconnect between Americans with their knowledge of what government does at any level and what they can expect their government to do for them. I even see this at the local level, with many people don't understand what does local government do for them. And in all this political upheaval, how do we ensure that citizens are adequately educated about their government and engaged? How do we get them engaged in asserting their rights to speak up?
I think it's a really important question, of course, and I think both me and Ellen talked about this a little bit. I think it's very difficult to find citizenry that is enthusiastic about participating in the democratic process if it doesn't seem like it's worth their time, right? Like if there's a feeling that if I do everything right, if I play by the rules, if I learn all the systems and the procedures and Robert's Rules of Order and all these things, but it still doesn't yield actual policy change, even if I'm in the majority. There's a feeling that there is a minoritarian government, and people see that, of course, through money in politics, through the Electoral College, through the way that we apportion Senate power in the federal government, through gerrymandering, so on and so forth. People see these things as eroding the democratic process and saying that there's, demonstrating that there's a huge chasm between popular will and policy choices that are made because of these distortions. I think that creates a tremendous amount of friction not just in terms of our ability to deliver information on how to become civically engaged, but in the way that we think about how folks self-motivate to become civically engaged. I think we can lead people to the pamphlets on how to be, how to deliver public comment at a city council meeting, but people really only receive it if there is an intrinsic motivation to be involved. And I think that intrinsic motivation comes from whether or not you believe that what you're doing is whether it matters or whether you're just doing it for theater. And so I think, and again, we'll talk about the actual delivery mechanisms for this type of information, but I just think we're fighting an uphill battle if people rationally perceive that there is a huge disconnect between the majoritarian will that we believe is like a foundational principle of democracy, obviously with protection for minority views, of course, that we're all familiar with in the Constitution, but nonetheless, if we think that having the strength of our arguments doesn't matter in terms of policy outcomes because of these distortions, I just think we're going to be running into a wall.
Thank you, Devin.
Can anyone, and you can just shout this out, can anyone tell me the only profession enshrined in the Constitution? Journalism, right? So for all their faults, the founding fathers understood the important function that a free press can play. And at a time when trust in the media is at an all-time low, when news avoidance is at an all-time high, 42% of Americans avoid the news because it's overly negative and it has an impact on their mental health. And so at Solutions Journalism Network, where I work, we work with newsrooms to not just tell people what's wrong, right? We talked about poverty, we talked about government effectiveness, and we're all very aware of where the problems exist, right? In all of these different facets. But I like to think about what the world would look like if the media spent as much time talking about what can be done about it. Who's doing it better? And the other thing I'll add is that I think it's also important, we spend so much time and thought into our diet, right? What we eat. If we eat too much of our favorite things, like our doctor will yell at us, right? Like we have a good sense of that. And I think at a time when there's more access than ever to information, we're also living in the richest country in the history of the world, but that hasn't translated into outcomes, right? So I think we also need to be thinking about what kind of media we consume. Obviously, more people are looking at social media, thinking about where it comes from, and thinking about if it tells us how we can engage in the community, right? If it gives us that information. How many people here have access to a voter guide, like an actual detailed, informative voter guide? That's amazing. Where are you all from? Because this, Colorado, okay, yes. So you have a thriving local media ecosystem in Colorado. Yeah, so you have it really well. I work with journalists all around the country, and that's one of the things we try to help them do because their communities don't have information on what the ballot measures are. And so we just created a guide based on best practices of how to help newsrooms make ballot measures that use a solutions journalism frame. Not just who's saying this policy, but is there evidence it actually works and what that could look like for your community. So traditional problem-focused journalism is really good at what went wrong yesterday, right? We're all really aware of poverty, all these different crises. What solutions journalism can do is tell us what could go right tomorrow. And I think that's all information that it's our duty to seek that out and understand that.
Well, I have a lot of thoughts about what was already set up here. It's interesting because I think that there are a lot of people out there who are turning off and apathetic and not engaged in the way that Devin was describing, but I also hear from a lot of people who just want to be told, what can I do? What can I do to make a difference? How can I engage in a way that is productive? One of my fellow panelists from a panel I was on yesterday said that he was not impressed with the No Kings protest because there was no agenda. It was just an exercise in venting. Everybody turns out on the street, we're mad as hell and we're not going to take this anymore, but there's no demand at the end of the day that is specific and says, and therefore, these are our demands. This is what we want. And that is hard to do because, a lot of people turn out and people have different issues and one person's mad about this and another person is mad about that. So to try and come up with that list of that agenda item of what it is we want to happen differently than what is happening today, that's a challenging project, but I'm not sure that anybody is actually undertaking that. I get an endless stream of petitions in my inbox that say, here, sign this petition that says this, and sign this petition that says that. And I think, yeah, I agree with that. Yeah, I agree with that. But none of it actually seems to have a concrete endpoint. So I think those of us who want people to be more engaged need to do some harder thinking about exactly how it is we want people to engage, because I think there's a real hunger out there for some sense of direction as to how we can together make a better country. I was reading just this morning, the latest polling from Pew shows that most people think our democracy is heading in the wrong direction. And, again, there are Democrats and there are Republicans, and they have different reasons why they think that the democracy is heading in the wrong direction. But there is this general sense that things are not going right. And I can remember, I'm old enough to remember when people actually believed in the good things that government can do. The other day, we gathered around a little phone and watched a spaceship blast off as a group of us were gathered around the dining room table. And we felt, I felt a renewed sense like I remember feeling when the first space mission, I know I'm dating myself, but I think I have some fellow travelers in the room here with me. I remember that sense of excitement when the space missions were first taking off 50 years ago, and I had a sense of that again, that America can do great things, inspiring things that are hard, that require a lot of people to come together and work together. So I think that's still out there, and we can capitalize on that. When we talk about civic education, I think about how many people, don't know there are 3 branches of government or can't identify them and couldn't name the Chief Justice of the United States. Not the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. His title is actually Chief Justice of the United States. Or the Speaker of the House, or, people that who live in Washington and sort of imbibe this on a daily basis. Like, well, how can people not know that? So, there's a problem of civic education that people don't know the basic facts about our government. But I also think there's a problem that we are not doing a good enough job of teaching people at all levels, in the schools, in the senior centers, around the country, how to evaluate information, because the media landscape has become so diverse, because people no longer rely on legacy media organizations that have old-fashioned trained journalists who know how to check facts and don't, that's some influencer on TikTok who's just saying, the latest thing that popped into their heads that they think is going to get them more likes or more views. So I think that is this part of civic education, teaching people how to better evaluate, to find better sources, to find reliable media outlets, to find trusted sources of information. I think that is another project that we need to engage in, and certainly I don't think our schools are even attempting this project.
I'm turning my notes away from you. No, I was going to say some of that.
Oh,
Yeah, I'm just kidding. I'm kidding. So I said on this panel, I'm just going to say, yeah, what Ellen said. That's what I'm going to say the whole time. Look, I think that we have to back up and zoom out a little bit, right? So Ellen just touched on a little bit of this. There are different people in different demographic groups who want to engage in different ways, or who care about engagement, or who don't even know what civic engagement actually even means, and what civic education is, right? I have 2 kids who just went through high school, one who's about to graduate, God willing, who you know, we'll see. No, he's definitely graduating. It's all good. But you know, there is no such thing as civics education in school anymore. Nothing. We live right outside of Washington, D.C. So he took AP government, and that was a choice that he took it. And of course, I loved it because I was on the Hill all the time, and so I would send him pictures of like sconces in the House of Representatives that had eagles on them and said, hey, check it out for your AP government class. Or, you know, did you know that there's a subway underneath the Capitol? And he was like, I do now. But those things, because he's a kid who grew up in Washington, and so it infused his whole sense of things. When he comes here next year to school as a freshman at CU Boulder, he is going to find out that so many of his peers don't really care about ending the government shutdown. And they don't even know that the government is shut down right now, right? That pieces of the government are shut down. And so like his involvement in all of this is really different because he was brought up with it. He lived it and breathed it. He came to every protest. We have a wall in our house, which is just the cool signs that we had from all the different protests. Ellen has seen it, she can attest to it. And so, you know, civic education is really important in schools, but I will also say schoolhouse rock, right? Like, we should have a reboot of Schoolhouse Rock. And it should go on TikTok, and it should go on Instagram, and it was the way that, you know, people of my generation learned how to recite the preamble to the Constitution, and we can still do it now, right? Because you can sing the song. And you knew the way that bills became a law because that poor little bill was sitting on the steps on Capitol Hill, right? And so you knew those things. Now, I don't know why there isn't a reboot of that. I don't know why that's not popularized in a way that give people that basic education about how government functions. But that is also a little bit different than civic education, because civic education is about what is your role in that process. And I know we're going to talk more about that, but I would just lay out on the table that I think that different groups of people see that role differently for themselves. So touching a little bit on what Devin was saying, but I think that is true both in terms of age, you know, who votes the most? Older people vote the most, right? Younger people spike and then forget about it for a little while, right? So we know all of these different things, but their points of entry into civic engagement are really different, and the reason why they get involved is very different. That is true for religious groups, that is true for racial groups, that is true for class groups, that is true for age groups. So when we talk about civic engagement, it's not one big answer, although I do think that Schoolhouse Rock is one part of the solution, because it goes across everybody to everything, right? But I think we have to think about different strategies of how we engage people, for what purposes, and how they find their why in why they should be engaged, and they figure out their how that is meaningful to them.
Well, Hidar, thank you very much for kind of queuing that up for us. And I'm going to follow on with a question that came from the audience, which is, how do you define civic engagement? And you've kind of started to do that. And then the follow-up question is, if you could encourage every university across the country to implement one idea or practice to foster civic engagement education, what would it be?
I'll do the first part of that because I think that's a little bit more straightforward. We need more time to think about what we want to change the nationwide curriculum. I think it is unfortunate, though I think understandable, that when people generally use the term, you know, civic participation, people think voting, obviously, because it's like the most common way that we engage in the civics process. I think we should all vote, obviously. I think that's like critical, obviously. Like voting is key, but I think that I assume that the way we've been defining it on this panel is really the question of how are we an informed, active, like heft-moving citizenry, like with a capital C? Like how are we citizens? How are we shaping not just electoral results, but policy decisions that are made? How are we shaping the civic culture? How are we showing up to, again, ensure that there is a reflection of popular will in outcomes? And so when I think about what civic education means and what civic involvement is, it is not just a thing that you do every 4 years or every 2 years or even every, once a year, every November. Like I think it really is the 24/7, 365 activity of what it means to be an active participant in like a robust democracy that is not just about electoral outcomes, but about things as benign as the potholes being filled or the stop sign being erected where the kids are crossing the street, and the funding decisions and all the things that go with that. So obviously the bar is quite high, but I think one of the things that Harar was getting into is that creates more entry points for people to get, their feet wet a little bit. And I think that if we are constraining our imagination as to what we want civic involvement to be just to voting, it means that we are doing this work in fits and stops, right? Like it's not consistent. It doesn't create multiple entry points that are compelling for folks to have really, the building of muscle memory for what it means to be like an active, engaged citizen over the long term. So I think breadth is important when we're thinking about what civics is.
I think, thinking about the curriculum question, I'd like to see universities require that students, pick an issue that they care about, figure out who is working on that issue at any level of government, local, state, federal, international, and come up with a plan for contacting people who are working on that issue and trying to get involved and trying to move the ball forward in the way that they would like to see it. So actually, a class in civic engagement that says, all right, now you're going to get involved, and there's got to be some issue that you care about that some level of government is working on. Pick the issue, whatever it is, and go out there and see what people have to say about it and see how you can try and move change.
Can I just say, the barrier to entry to being engaged in civic change is not high. It's actually super easy. You go to a town council meeting and sign up to speak, right? I mean, Jan can speak to that from the city council perspective here. She might not have wanted all the people to come and speak all the time, but it's about finding an issue that moves you and actually engaging, because so many times people don't actually weigh in. And so when we talk all about the special interests and the money in politics and all that, what I'm going to leave to Ellen, but it's so much less than that. Part of the reason that those forces have the power that they do is because other people aren't actually speaking up and voicing their opinions and doing that at the most local level, like about the potholes and the stop signs and the books and the, all these different things. But the ability to go and testify in the state legislature, in the county government, to meet with your member of Congress, you just pick up the phone and which I understand that picking up the phone can be a barrier to entry to many people these days, but you can reach out and you can actually schedule that and do that. There was I don't want to keep bringing my kids up, but there was a bill in the Maryland legislature about funding for a specific kind of medical treatment that was relevant to our family. And my 13-year-old son at the time came and testified about why this was important to our family, right? And I was like, oh, this is pretty cool. I've done some pretty cool stuff in my life, but at 13, I wasn't testifying in front of the state legislature, right? And it was super easy for him to do. And it opened the door to knowing that that was a tool that he had in his toolkit, that he could use at any point when he wanted to actually voice an opinion on a particular issue. But we don't do that. So I agree with Ellen, make students do that. Pick an issue. Doesn't matter what the issue is. Show them that it's possible. But not just our students. How many of you have, and maybe this is a bad question, but how many of you have spoken at, testified at, written a letter, done something besides a protest? I don't mean a protest, but actually taken that next step. That's amazing, because you live in Boulder, and which is why we like coming to Boulder all the time, right? In many other communities, there would not be as many people who know that it's not as hard as it seems. So good at you, and we'll come back to how you get your neighbors to do that in a little bit.
We've got a question from a student that kind of asks a different type of question, which I think is also important. I go to a smaller college where there is constant political dialogue happening. As a young person who does a lot of activism on campus, what advice do you have about burnout?
So I can say something from the perspective of a journalist that thinks a lot about what the world could look like, right, if it was different, right? And so what Ellen described, basically is solutions journalism. So if you're a university out there and you're hiring people to do that research, work with journalists, like student journalists, to actually report on that, right? Is there evidence that what they're doing is working, right? And that's sort of one of the things I think about a lot, is that we're really good at calling out problems, right? But the stories we're not hearing is how that change happens. I mentioned that newsroom in rural Louisiana. They have this huge construction happening. It's making them sick. One of the main things they heard after they were told that journalists never come here is that they were told that, this thing is coming into their community. There's nothing we can do to change that. Like, there's nothing, like, we're powerless, right? Like, and so I think part of that is maybe like the realization that they're going up against one of the most powerful corporations in the history of the world, but also they haven't heard the stories of communities that are organizing, right? And so I think we need to spend a lot more time telling those stories, right? Because that kind of construction, those kind of buildings are popping up all over the country, and to share those stories can really change the way you see the world, right? I think that's what we really need, to change the way we see the world and see our role in it. And I think there's so many great examples happening right now and in history that really give us a blueprint of how to make that progress.
I'll say, kudos to the students who engage in on-campus activism. I think it's critically important for both improving the ecosystem here, obviously, that's worthwhile in its own right, but also, building those muscles for fights in different institutions, because that work doesn't really end. This might sound obvious, but, as someone who is a professional advocate now, winning is really fun. And I think the joy of getting something over the line and feeling like you have accomplished something and made your community better, however big that community is, that outweighs the despair of 10 defeats. And so what I would advise to young people who are engaged in advocacy is, find the ways to feel like you're making tangible progress. It's better to feel like you are doing, that you're moving the ball forward rather than just talking and ruminating on the challenges, and defining success in ways that feel attainable. Because I think the burnout factor is real for folks across professions, but certainly in mine, that's a very real thing. But when we're able to orient our goals to things that feel achievable, even if they're ambitious, it's not to say that those are diametrically opposed, but things that are achievable, and then once we do achieve them, I find that quite replenishing for our own energy. So it's better to focus on the path forward and what's the next step, and actually putting points on the board. And once we do that, I think even if you lose along the way occasionally, the occasional win is what makes it all worth it.
There have been several questions coming in about journalism. traditional journalism. One mentioned that the University of Colorado has gotten rid of the teaching curriculum journalism and now calls it communications. So much talk about how, especially young people, learn about news, not through traditional journalism like, for example, I do, by reading newspapers and that kind of thing, but from Reddit and from TikTok, et cetera, et cetera. So given that whole environment and how we all try to educate ourselves, what advice do you have for for learning about civics and learning about what is happening with truthful, honest, researched information?
So I'm going to be on a panel after this about that topic, specifically about the role of influencers versus traditional media outlets. So I've never worked at a traditional media outlet. I've always worked for independent media. So I think it looks a little different for me. But I think part of it is just needing to appreciate what needing to appreciate what journalists do. Like, journalists are not good at explaining what they do. People don't have that understanding of what it takes to get something published in a story. And so I think part of it is just being transparent and letting people know why this article you've written is different than what someone recorded on Instagram or TikTok, right? So there's that, but I also think in terms of room for improvement for journalism, go talk to people, try to understand what's happening in your community. There's a lot of things that influencers can do really well. There's some influencers I trust more than some media outlets, right? I'm the first one to say that they play an important role, but there's a role that can't be replaced, that only a whole newsroom can do, right? Do a community-wide reporting project, hold public meetings like this, where the public gets to ask journalists questions about what they do and pitch them story ideas, right? There's so much more that, and there's great examples of that happening all over the country. That didn't really answer your question, but I wanted to share that. Sorry.
We have a complex media environment now, right? We don't have 3 television stations, and we don't have, we even have reduced national newspapers, and we certainly have a crisis in local newspapers. And that's where a lot of people get their information about the community. So when Jaisal asks about the voter guide, right? That comes from the state, though. That doesn't come from the journalists. And so the idea that the media ecosystem in which people are getting their information, in which we are getting our information, is compromised in a variety of different ways, both because we don't have access to accurate information, because truth is being destabilized. I'll just stop with that one. And because we don't know sometimes what's what can we believe now, right? So, and then the role of disinformation as well, which, we haven't talked about disinformation and misinformation. The fact is that it's up to us, and it's another form of civic engagement, to ensure that we are educated truthfully about what is happening on the ground in our communities, as well as nationally and internationally. So you're sitting there going, so how do we do that? If there are fewer outlets to trust or to know that they are credible, you check your facts the same way that journalists check their facts. You look at a variety of news sources. You talk to people. You check and you don't only read one thing. You seek out information from a variety of different sources, and then you also talk to trusted messengers, right? One of the best ways that we know to combat misinformation is by talking to people that you trust about how they understand, how they see, and how they understand what is going on around you. But that is something that has shifted. The onus on, you can't just watch Peter Jennings. I don't know if he's the right person to maybe not Peter Jennings. Who's the right person? Walter Cronkite. You can't just look at Walter Cronkite and know and believe that what is coming is the whole story. And sometimes Walter Cronkite wasn't telling the whole story either, right? Maybe that's a little blasphemous for me to say, but it has shifted responsibility, and it has made news much more complicated. But there is important work that is being done by really good journalists, including student journalists, who are working and learning the profession. You know, student journalists actually make up the largest cadre of State House reporters in the country. So because of the loss of local newspapers, they don't have a State House beat, and so oftentimes State Houses are close to where there are colleges and universities and where they still have newspapers. They will take up the beat. Oftentimes, where there is no local newspaper, the student newspaper at a college is the newspaper of record for that community. That is true in Berkeley, California. That is true in Ann Arbor, Michigan. And so if you need to publish a public notice, you have to do it through the Michigan Daily. Okay, that's interesting. So the role of journalism here at CU is really important. The role of journalists broadly is super important. And the role for you as consumers of news and people who want to be engaged in their community is really important, to both demand good journalism and to dive into making sure that the news that you are reading is accurate, truthful, and you are not kind of passing along misinformation from various kinds of outlets.
And I'll just quickly add that support your local journalists, right? Like, this kind of reporting we're talking about takes money. The biggest challenge that journalists tell us for their capacity to cover these stories is funding. They don't have enough money. So that's something that you can do in your community. You know, those media outlets that are doing that could really use your money and your support. So that's something that we can do in the meantime.
I want to pull on a thread that I think has been sort of undercurrent in a couple of the answers here, and that is talk to people in real life. Get offline and talk to people and listen to people, especially if they are people that don't agree with you, that don't come from the same place. And I think a lot of us, both in our online lives, but also in our physical lives, we tend to be surrounded by, and I know Boulder's another one of these communities, I live in one of these communities, we tend to be surrounded by people who agree with us, who have the same kind of media diets that we do and have the same kind of views. And I think that it is part of being an involved citizen is getting out of your bubble and trying to engage with people who come from different backgrounds and have different views, and as I said, not just to talk to them, but to listen to them and to hear what their concerns are. And also, while you're doing that, get outside. This goes back to the burnout question. Don't spend your entire life doing activism. You need balance in your life. Breathe this, particularly in a beautiful place like Boulder, Colorado. Get outside and breathe fresh air and walk on the grass and feel the beauty of the world around us. And I think that is very helpful in preventing burnout, to go back to the previous question.
That's difficult, though. I find myself right now, I've got a visitor from out of town, and he is extremely conservative, and I would say I'm fairly moderate, but he probably would not. He would call me liberal. And I began to tell him about the debate between Susan Rice and John Bolton. And just immediately the reaction in his face about John Bolton, and I said they actually agreed on a lot of things, which I think the reporting actually said that they had agreed on most everything. So that's what I find difficult, is in really engaging in a conversation that seems to be with very good friends and family members, but how do you get past that kind of confirmation bias that I certainly would prefer to hang out with people who agree with me and confirm all the opinions that I have. It's much more comfortable. How do you explore those conversations in a way that are truly open and honest conversations? any of you who have recommendations. I'm willing to take them.
So we have a resource, it's like a journalistic framework called Complicating the Narrative. And it basically is a way to talk to people without judging them and by showing them you're actually listening. And one of the ways, and so yeah, we're like trained to shut down when we're confronted by people we're told are our like mortal enemies, right? And so I think by trying to, I mean, this is a tool for journalists, but I think everyone can use it. There's questions like, what do you think the other side gets right? Right? Like getting away from those binaries. Is there anything the other side could do to win you over, right? Or what do you think the other side gets wrong about you, right? Like really trying to complicate, because like no one is, you know, these binaries that exist online don't exist in real life. And so really trying to understand that. And the other thing I'd say that I learned through some reporting is there's a practice called deep canvassing. Has anyone heard of deep canvassing? And it was really effective in rural Pennsylvania and Georgia a couple elections ago. I think maybe less so much in the last election, but basically it's a way for people to go out and they're political canvassers, which actually is like very ineffective in terms of like persuasion. And so they found that deep canvassing is much more persuasive. Instead of just telling someone to vote for someone, which normally is what canvassers do, they try to ask them questions like, we're talking about healthcare. Have you ever had anyone in your family that's needed support, that's needed healthcare, right? And so all that to say, there are ways that we can sort of touch upon our shared experiences and shared humanity. And there's actually a resource for that. So if you want it, I'm happy to share it with you. And there's some really powerful storytelling that can come out of that.
Here are a couple of questions from the audience. One which I'll paraphrase. One is, how do we support civic education for regular people? And I think it's also similar to another question that comes in that discusses how busy people are, caring for their children, they're communicating with teachers, employees, bosses, fixing their homes, being distracted by media. How do people actually find the time to fact check? From neighborhood groups, from schools, what ideas do you have about how very busy people who are just trying to keep up with their children's lives and their own jobs, how can they educate themselves to become civically engaged?
So I'm involved in a lot of conversations in Washington about how do we save democracy. It's really fun. Lots and lots and lots of meetings. And so finally, I just turned to some of my colleagues and I was like, how do we save democracy? And one person said, oh, well, we need to have voting and we need to have civic education and we need to do all these things that we've kind of talked about here, right? And I said, my solution actually is much more simple. We have to decide that we want to save it, right? It has to be a priority. And so everybody is super busy. Those trad wives, they're really busy. I was on the trad wives panel a few minutes ago. So, everybody is really busy, but we set our priorities about how we use our time. And sometimes it really doesn't take that long. There was a period of time that I was calling my senators in the White House all the time, and I just had them in my phone. And let me just say, I'm not a superhero around these things, right? Not at all. And I had I still have the phone numbers in my phone that would go straight to their office and straight to the White House. And I would be in the car, dropping my kids off at school, and I'd be like, hey guys, time to call the senator. And of course we would never get through to anybody, and we would leave a message on whatever issue it was that we were stirring things up on that day. And it was just then I went off and I called my best friend to talk about complained about my children after that. It was just part of what got into the day. And so how do we save democracy? How do we promote civic engagement? We have to want to do that. And so we need to make it a priority. But again, the bar to doing that and to doing things every day or every other day or once a week or once a month is not high. But you have to decide that it's a priority for you and to decide what you're going to do.
Plus one to all of that. There was something that Ellen, you mentioned in a previous answer as well with respect to the No Kings rally. I think there really is a value for folks who are doing organizing work to sort of spoon feed actions for folks. We have to make it easy because we all understand that the amount of disposable time that people have is like directly related to like socioeconomic factors, right? Like it's really hard if you are a low-income single mother of color to be able to take time away from your kids to be able to go to a protest, to go to a city council meeting if it's when you work, whatever it might be, right? And so I think to the extent that we are able to, as organizers, be able to say, if you care about this, like if you were already sort of pre-primed to care about a given issue, whether it's anything from something as highfalutin as democracy, which we all love, or something that's more granular like the streetlight issue. This is how you can plug in, this is what you need to do, this is the script, this is how it's going to contribute to the broader project, and give it to people straight that, maybe your individual testimony is not super, it's not moving the needle entirely, but because we have 50 people doing this, it's really gonna ladder up, and this is what the value add is of your time, so people can make that rational decision to say, this is worth it for me to take time away from my kids. I think that's like how we do this for the people who are already interested but just don't know where to go. That's like where we probably start, right? Because that's the easier or lower hanging fruit. I think we have a different set of strategies for the folks who aren't paying attention at all and who we sort of view as necessary for the broader democratic project. That's a bigger mountain to climb. But I don't know if we are able to sort of teach our way out of a legitimacy crisis that people feel, even if they don't use those words. Like I think we understand that there are friction points to getting involved in the democratic process, but I think that we have the work to do to try to build a story where collective activism is still worth it, even despite all the headwinds that we've discussed ad nauseum up here.
And Devin, as a follow-on, how do you recommend communicating with that single mother with kids in school and may not know how to get engaged in it with a concern that she's got?
Yeah, I think the first step is how do you reach and identify people in the first place? And I think organizers who are really credible in their community, who have deep ties to people, who know people just through everyday life, are able to say, you know what, so-and-so, you may not have been involved before, but your voice really matters, your experience really matters, this is how it's going to be additive. I think it's very difficult for organizers to come into a community without credibility, without ties, without roots. So I think step one is you've got to be able to identify who's credible in a community. From there, I really do think it is saying, here's what we're trying to do, here's why I think it matters to you, maybe you already believe that, maybe you need to be convinced, but here's our theory of the case, and this is how we want you to plug in, and it's just super structured. We're not going to have, we're not pulling the wool over people's eyes in terms of what the time commitment is. It's very, constrained, and here's the value add. And that's how we're able to get people in. And then it's, okay, you came to the public comment. That was great. How did you feel? Maybe we won, maybe we lost, but are you still invested in this fight? Can you come again? And if you can't, do you know someone else who is similarly situated to you who can come in as well? And so I think it's sort of what Jess was talking about with deep canvassing, deep organizing. These ongoing relationships really are the currency for I think for civics broadly, and I think that we are up against an increasingly atomized society where we are both hyper interconnected because of what we see through our phones, and yet not connected locally. I don't know, my phone is very national or internationally focused. I think most people are more aware of what's happening nationally than they are with what's happening down the street, and I think that leads to an atrophy of our interconnectedness at the local level, which makes local organizing more difficult. So it's sort of like the bowling alone thesis, right? If people have read that book. So I think it just starts with relationships.
Thank you.
So I just wanted to share some reporting I've done recently in my community. It's about the local Ice Watch, and I was going to ask if anyone here is in an Ice Watch to raise your hand. That's probably a bad idea to identify yourself. So I don't know if the camera can see you or not. So, but yeah. So starting last spring in Baltimore. And I guess I'll just take a step back real quick. So we all understand that in the lead up to the last election, the conservative movement, the Trump campaign really made immigration a central point, and these claims of immigrants committing crimes, right? And instead of like actually contextualizing that, the media just amplified those claims, and it helped lead to a massive shift in views of immigrants, which has since rebounded to its highest historic ever, positive view of immigrants according to the polls, right? And what that actually did in places like Baltimore, my community, was that people wanted to get involved and they wanted to do something. And so with their neighbors, right? That's what we're talking about, those human connections when we don't know what we can do except talk to our neighbors. And so some of my neighbors got together, started knocking on doors. And they got more people involved. Regardless, there's a lot of single moms in my community. There's also young adults that have lots of free time, right? They knocked on about 200 doors in the first month, and now and since then, and so I've been able to report on this because it's my community. People know me. It's not something that I'd recommend talking to journalists about if you're involved in it, but because they know me, I was able to sort of follow this movement. I went like canvassing and door knocking with them. I got a drone license so I could film part of a story with a drone. Like that's how important this was to me. But it's just ordinary people that were going door to door, learning best practices from what's happening around the country. A lot of, we haven't had a huge influx yet, so people have been preparing. And then they were getting, and then people were hearing about this, and then people in other neighborhoods were like, can I join your Ice Watch in my neighborhood? And they're like, no, you need to start your own. Like it has to be like a very local neighborhood thing. You have to be able to recognize the same people to know you can trust them, right? So they held a training last year at a church. 300 people packed this room, and since I last checked, 12 other neighborhoods who had representatives at that meeting have started their own Ice Watches around the city. And they've really transformed, and so my whole point is they've really transformed into mutual aid and a way to connect with neighbors at a time when we really can't trust what we see online, right? And this other story I did quickly was about how zines and art and prints, right? Physical papers have become the latest organizing tool, because that's information that can't be hacked. It's not AI, right? It's real things that people have verified and put in there, and those have get out into your community and get offline would be my best advice.
Okay, we have about 7 minutes left, so I'd like to give each of you the opportunity to give summarizing comments or final comments. I'd like to thank all of you for submitting questions and being very involved in this conversation. And Hadar, would you like to start?
Sure. So we've talked a lot about really kind of local organizing, and a little bit about kind of No Kings and some federal stuff, right? Some national level stuff. But it's striking to me that, what's today? Today's Wednesday. So 4 days ago, 78% of the electorate in Hungary went and voted out the Orban government after 16 years in an unfair election. It was a free but unfair election, right? I think it was. It was an election in which, right, there wasn't independent media, there wasn't a way to campaign, there were a lot of signs of it being an unfair election, but 78% of the people showed up because it was important to them, right? Some of them were engaged politically, but a lot of them weren't, because a lot of people went to jail if they were, or they left the country because they were under threat, right? In Seoul, South Korea, a couple years ago, right? The president declared martial law, and millions of people came out on the street, and he rolled it back, and then he was indicted, and he went to jail, right? The No Kings rallies are important for showing a lot of people the way that they can show up, but we don't have a lot of muscle memory in recent memory in this country about having sustained protests that cause actual impacts and accountability to the people who are in government. We look to elections as our way to make transitions, but we panic about whether there are going to be midterms. I think there will be, and what that's going to look like, right? But there are lots of steps in between that motivate people in a lot of different ways. In many of these countries, it's around corruption, right? And we haven't even talked about that. But the point about it is that there are different things that motivate people at different moments to stand up in different ways, and sometimes they are ways that are dangerous to them. They don't know what the outcome of it's going to be, but it forces change. So civic engagement, civic education leads to civic engagement, right? People find their why, their what, their how in different ways, but we have really powerful examples that we can look to that are streaming in all news outlets at this point that give me a lot of hope about the ability of people to stand up and to take back what might be sliding away from us in a way that is really beautiful, which is nonviolent, and which really demonstrates that the people do have power to assert their rights and to protect democracy. So thank you.
Yeah, imagine if we had 80% turnout, ever.
Even 78.
Even 78, okay. Maybe I'm exaggerating a little bit. Yeah, I mean, I think the high we've ever had is 66% turnout. And, you know, there are other countries that do that better. So, you know, I agree with everything that Hadar just said. I actually agree with pretty much everything that anybody said on this panel. This is not one where we had, you know, sort of a wild card from, you know, who was going to stand up and say, no, we don't want to have civic engagement, right? You know, this isn't the panel for that, and this isn't the audience for that. So, yes, we all need to vote, and we need to get other people to vote, but we also need to get involved in other ways in making our communities better. You know, start small if that seems more accessible to you. Get one other person involved, not somebody that you know really is already into this issue and engaged. Try and engage somebody new in an issue that you care about. And you know, there are cross-partisan issues. There are issues that there is widespread agreement on in this country, and it still doesn't happen at the national level, but maybe it can sometimes happen at the state and local level. There are ballot initiatives on redistricting that has come up a couple of times, but we haven't really talked about it much. There are states where individuals started ballot initiatives, and then it just caught fire and they got other people involved, and they ended up with independent redistricting commissions that got them fairer districts, more representative districts, districts where there was a need to appeal to people across the aisle and not just to the most extreme elements of one party or the other. And, you know, that's like classic civic engagement, citizen action. And there are states now that are pushing back against that and trying to limit those options for ballot initiatives. But, you know, that is another way that people can get involved. I take inspiration from people like Katie Fahey. This is a few years ago in Michigan. Just somebody who said, you know, I really hate the way redistricting is done in the state of Michigan. Who agrees with me? And she started out on Facebook. I know I said you're supposed to get involved with real people offline, but, you know, sometimes the online can be a good organizing tool. And just from one Facebook post, she had no experience in this, and she ended up organizing a successful ballot initiative that changed the way they do districts in the state of Michigan. So never believe that one person can't make a difference, but you have to get other people with you. One person alone can't make a difference, but one person who gets other people involved and engaged and is willing to reach out maybe to some people that are not, just the people who are automatic, they're automatically going to agree with you on everything, but, maybe there are people who are a little bit further away from you on some issues. Just keep reaching out, and if everybody in this room engaged one, I think this is a pretty engaged audience, but if every person in this room found one person who was not engaged already and got them engaged, and then that person got one more person engaged, pretty soon we'd have a lot of people. So
Thank you, Ellen.
that's where
And Jessel, we've just got short comments here, please.
So I know we're almost out of time, but so agree with everyone. This is a great conversation. If you go to Solutions Journalism Network's website, there's a database of over 17,000 solutions journalism stories all across the world. Stories like how that measure got passed in Michigan, right? So use that resource, find out what's happened, like what's worked to challenge the biggest problems in your community. And I also just took notes, so we're gonna get offline, meet our neighbors, find credible sources of information, find ways to get involved, and support your local media outlets, right? That's what we're gonna do afterwards, so.
Yeah, plus one to all of that. I think civics and democracy at their core are about people, right? And I would hazard to guess that there is a pretty strong correlation between the strength of one's social bonds and social networks and an orientation towards being pro-democracy. And that loneliness and isolation probably correlates with being more skeptical of democracy. So I think if we want to build a culture here that is pro-democratic and pro-civic engagement, it starts by knowing our neighbors and bringing people into the fold. So, thank you.
That's one more round of applause for you participating as well as for our great panelists. Thank you so much for coming.